Alright, so here we go with example 2, which gives us more rational exponents to evaluate. Okay. However, now we're going to start mixing in negative signs with these fraction exponents every way we can think of to help us understand how the negatives mix with the fraction exponents. So the first one gives us negative 49 to the 1/2. Now, because the negative is not in parentheses like here in part B, the 1/2 power does not apply to the negative. In this case, you want to think of the negative outside as multiplication by -1. So this is actually meaning -1 times 49 to the 1/2. So we're going to calculate 49 to the 1/2, which we know means square root of 49 from our definition. And then we're going to multiply that by -1. The square root of 49 is 7. So we take 7 and we multiply it by -1, which means our final result here is going to be -7. Okay. So when you have a negative sign not in parentheses, the fraction power does not apply to it. In fact, if you notice, all the negative sign outside did was change our result to a negative. Now part B is a little different. Okay? When you have a negative sign in parentheses, then what you have to do is put the entire base of -49 underneath the square root. Okay, it's another square root because the denominator is 2 here. But at this point, you should sort of be a little suspicious because you're trying to take the square root of a negative number. Okay, and if you remember, the square root of a negative number is not possible, okay? Because there's no number that you're going to multiply by itself to give you -49. 7 times 7 is positive 49, and -7 times -7 is still positive 49. So this guy is not a real number. So when you end up trying to take the square root of a negative number, your final result is going to be that it's not a real number. Now this is a little different than part C. Okay, in part C, we're taking -64 to the 1/3 power. And that 1/3 power makes all the difference. Okay, so what happens here is you still have the negative inside parentheses, so the whole number -64 is going to be inside your radical, but because it's a 1/3 power, we get the cube root of -64. Now the cube root of -64 we can deal with, right? -64 is -4 times -4 times -4. Which means the cube root is going to take these 3 identical factors and give you a single factor back. So the cube root of -64 is -4. Okay, so the difference between part B and part C is that in part B we ended up getting the square root of a negative number, and that we can't deal with. That's not a real number. But in part C we got the cube root of -64, and because this number was odd, we could work it out. The cube root of -64 is -4. And part A is different than both B and C because in part A the negative sign is not in parentheses, so it simply makes the result negative. Alright, so here's part D, E, and F of the same example. We're dealing with negative signs still, but now we've thrown negatives in the exponent as well. So let's see how this affects things. Right. In part D, we have to deal with -49 to the -1/2. The first thing you should notice is that this negative in front of the base is not in parentheses. So that negative sign is just going to tag along as multiplication by -1 and change the result to a negative number. However, this negative sign in the exponent means that I have to flip whatever it's connected to. So -1/2 is connected to the 49, so that gets flipped to 1/49 to the 1/2. Okay, so the rule about negative exponents says to get rid of a negative exponent, you flip the base and then change the exponent to a positive. Okay, so then I still have this -1 multiplication that's going to change my result to a negative, but now I have to use my fraction exponent definition and make this 1 over the 1/2 power is the same as the square root. So ultimately I get -1 times 1 over root 49, which is 1 over 7, which means I just have -1/7 as my final result here. Now part E looks slightly different than part D, but it's actually very different. Okay, so pay attention to these parentheses. Because the -49 is in parentheses, when you flip, because of the negative exponent, you're going to put the entire number -49 in the denominator, but also you're going to take the entire number -49 to the 1/2 power. Okay, so what happens is you get rid of this negative exponent by flipping, but the result has a -49 still in parentheses to the 1/2 power. Okay. Now you change the 1/2 power to a root. This is 1 over the square root of -49. And at this point, the alarm bells should be going off in your head because the square root of -49 is not a real number. Okay, because the negative was in parentheses here and here, you end up with the negative underneath the square root, which means your final result here is going to be not a real number. So actually the negative exponent didn't change the result because this negative underneath the square root breaks everything and gives us not a real number. So part F is very similar to part E, except instead of a 1/2 power, we have a 1/3 power, which is going to change the type of radical we end up with. But nonetheless, this negative downstairs here is still in parentheses. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of my negative exponent by flipping. All right, because this -64 is in parentheses, I'm going to put 1 over -64 to the positive 1/3 power. Right, flipping got rid of my negative. Now I'm going to rewrite the 1/3 power as a radical. So 1 over the cube root of -64. But the cube root of -64 we can deal with, since we know that -4 times -4 times -4 is -64. So this ends up being 1 over -4, right? The cube root of -64 is -4. And we usually write the negative sign out in front, so this would be -1/4 as our final result.